character consistency and authenticity. Frame switching has been observed to bring both certain advantages and disadvantages to the individual. In their transformative theory of multi or biculturalism, West and everybody else on that research team remark that frame switching, along with other strategies for managing the internalization of multiple and potentially conflicting cultural frames, together enable the multicultural individual to do a number of things. So let's look at those. To reconcile new and old information about the self without sacrificing its clarity, to possess broader and more complex self-schemas, experience a greater flexibility of the self, and a multicultural individual can develop greater creativity and wisdom with respect to being able to see the bigger picture and think in abstract terms, because you're not so invested in any one particular perspective. You see that you can switch perspectives, and it kind of gives you a bigger picture sort of point of view on life. So perhaps these are some of the benefits of being somebody who frame switches. However, these same psychological consequences might sometimes come at a cost to the individual. For instance, whereas the greater flexibility of self afforded by frame switching may seem like a benefit, a later study by West et al. Showed that in all contexts that have been extensively studied, and especially in the Western world, individuals who visibly frame switch are widely perceived as less authentic than individuals who present a consistent character regardless of the social context, by both themselves and third-party observers. The perception of an individual as inauthentic affects their social integration. The same study showed that frame-switching individuals were additionally rated lower on likability, trustworthiness, and warmth. It is commonly assumed that self-consistency is a marker of authenticity. This is something I intuited early on in my personal experience as someone who presents inconsistent character in daily life. As I moved between countries, spending near equal portions of my life in different social and cultural groups, and investing myself in each of them accordingly, I found that something so intimate as my voice would wax and wane, shape-shifting into new forms as I moved in and out of social contexts. My migratory patterns had left a mark on my voice, so that whenever I returned to a place of previous residence and encountered old friends there, I was invariably met with attitudes ranging from amusement to suspicion. As it happens, even sympathetic audiences can be momentarily disturbed, shocked, and weakened in their faith by the discovery of a picayune discrepancy in the impressions presented to them. This is Goffman writing that. I have sometimes been accused of affecting the way I speak because it is not the same way I used to speak. I've been perceived as acting inauthentically and faking my behaviors because they morphed over time and conflicted with previous impressions I had made. This was only compounded by the fact that I also frame switched in the short term. Different social contexts elicited different systems of behavior from me, and this was occasionally spotted when social contexts overlapped. Pirandello's Moscarda gives a familiarly mundane example of the problem of overlapping social contexts, namely the problem of meeting two friends from two different social groups at the same time. And here is a lovely quote from that novel. This is Moscarda's perspective, and he's saying, "It wasn't those two who were incompatible." Just to give some context, so Moscarda has two friends of his coming over, and they're from two different walks of life in Moscarda's life. And so he's saying, it wasn't those two who were incompatible, those strangers, one to the other. Both very polite and perhaps made to get along splendidly. It was the two yous that you suddenly discovered in yourself. For your old friend, you have one reality, and another for the new one. And in the intolerable embarrassment of thus finding yourself two men at the same time, you sought a trivial pretext to rid yourself, not of one of the visitors, but of one of the two selves that the pair obliged you to be at the same time. So this is a social situation, perhaps some of you may have been in or recognize, that you kind of discover sometimes when you bring two people from different parts of your life together. You might realize that you actually have two different versions of yourself that you present to your two friends, and that when they're in the same room together with you, suddenly you're in a conflict, like which one of you should be, because they're both expecting you to be a slightly different version of yourself, and you risk weirding one of them out by behaving differently. So the answer to this problem, Erving Goffman actually also recognized this problem, and the answer to it, Goffman observed, is what he calls audience segregation. And that is ensuring that this contextual overlap does not occur in the first place by segregating one's social encounters, a tactic he highlights as particularly prevalent in upwardly mobile individuals. As a teenager, I recall reflecting upon such interactions and asking myself whether I was, in fact, pretending to be somebody I was not. Oddly enough, I was not sure. It seemed like a question I should be able to answer easily. If pretending or putting on an act were a form of lying, ought not one know whether or not one was lying? But I did not know. The question of my authenticity was so puzzling that I spent the next 10 years developing a performance practice in order to ascertain whether or not I could feel authentic while also being multiple. Increasingly, I became drawn to asking why authenticity and inconsistency were intuited to be incompatible in the first place, and why this intuition persists. The acceptance of the self as multiple seems to extend at least as far back as William James, and yet social pressures still exist to tame that multiplicity into apparent singularity. And I'm referencing William James there in the last footnote. There's a quote from him where he says, "We may practically say that one has as many different social selves as there are distinct groups of persons about whose opinion one cares." So let's move on to lay theories of personality. So again, those kind of implicit ideas that we might harbor in everyday life about what a personality is. There is a branch of psychology which studies lay theories of personality, implicit theories which are active in shaping expectations about social interactions between persons. In a similar vein, we encountered some lay models of the mechanics of self in Chapter 2, from which we hope to unearth such implicit theories. So that was back when we were thinking about the vessel model, for instance. We were kind of examining some of the assumed shapes we attribute to self to explain its mechanics. Reflecting on their finding that people who are observed to frame switch are rated lower on authenticity, West et al. Proposed that the cultural aversion to behavioral inconsistency may be the product of two interrelated lay theories: dispositionism, which assumes that behavior is primarily caused by internal attributes. Another way we might call this is essentialism, an essentialist idea of self, that it kind of comes from within. This is that pointhood model that we encountered in Chapter 2. And an entity view of the self, that's the other theory, which assumes that internal attributes are stable across situations in time. Like a Sims character has kindness, outgoingness, different traits set at different values. We might imagine in the entity view of self that there first of all exist internal attributes to a person, and they're more or less fixed regardless of where I go, what kind of social context I'm in. I'll be equally outgoing or equally introverted, for example. So that's a distinctly non-contextual way of viewing personality. So their argument here is that actually there are these implicit ideas that people harbor about personality in everyday life that make us uncomfortable with the idea of inconsistent character. And they're citing dispositionism and entity view as these two theories that are contributing to that discomfort with inconsistency. While this cultural aversion to self-inconsistency seems to be stronger in Western societies, it seems to be present, if to a slightly lesser degree, in the non-Western societies studied too. Goffman also observed and frequently remarked on what is here called the entity view of the self, noting that individuals perform their character always as if it were the only one they could possibly perform, maintaining the facade of an essential self for their audience, even though that individual will go on to present a different character for a different audience. He proposes an explanation for this by way of a generalizable preference for consistency when he remarks, quote, "There seems to be a general feeling that the most real and solid things in life are ones whose description individuals independently agree upon." End quote. This is a fascinating proposition because it suggests that humans attach an intuitive epistemological significance to consistency. Epistemology, by the way, is the philosophy of knowledge. It asks, how do we know things? So what Goffman is saying is that in general, like in science, we tend to think that something is real or our idea of something is correct if it's confirmed from multiple angles. So Goffman is suggesting perhaps we believe in the reality of a person's character if it can be supported by multiple perspectives. So if lots of people encounter this person to be the same across time, then you're getting at the truth of that person. And so I'm phrasing that in the next segment I'm going to read here. A theory is corroborated when it is repeatedly observed to produce the same results. When information about a person is corroborated through the reappraisal of their consistent behavior across time and situations, it appears as though we have come closer to the truth of the person. Inconsistency, meanwhile, throws a spanner in the works. Something does not add up, and the person is most likely lying or presenting in a disingenuous way. So now we're getting at maybe some of the ideas that underpin why there's this cultural aversion that West and the team working with West noted regarding inconsistency in the presentation of self in social character. Maybe it's because there is a more general belief that things that are corroborated and reconfirmed again and again from multiple angles get us closer to the reality of something, to the truth of something. But is inauthenticity the only diagnosis we can offer in response to character inconsistency? So let's say, we have a person here and I've seen them act quite differently to the way you've seen them act. And so we are kind of suspicious as that person being authentic. We might say, because we are perceiving this person to act quite differently in our company, maybe they're fake, maybe they're inauthentic. But is inauthenticity the only diagnosis we can offer in response to this observation we've just had that there's a character inconsistency in this person? Okay, so one way to unsettle this idea a little bit, just to give one approach, is to invoke the parable of the blind men and the elephant. You may have heard of this parable. So in the parable, a group of blind men investigate an unknown animal. And each of these blind men is touching a different body part of what, unbeknownst to them, is an elephant. Each observer takes away a different impression of the creature, impressions that are in conflict to one another. And yet the elephant has not been trying to mislead them. It has just been standing there, being itself, but its being was too large and variegated to be apprehended all at once from all angles. So in the parable, these blind men start arguing. One of them touches the trunk of the elephant and says, "This is clearly a snake." And another one touches the side of the elephant and says, "This is clearly a cow." They start to disagree because their information is not lining up. But the elephant is not being inauthentic. The elephant is just being itself. It's just that perhaps it is too large and too diverse. It's got trunks and it's got legs and it's got sides to be equally interpreted from all these different angles. And maybe the same is true of the self. Perhaps the self is also, in a sense, too large for its audience. And perhaps this is why it is capable of leaving conflicting impressions in its wake. The conditions surrounding the performance of self are integral to the impressions it gives and the subsequent social dynamics it shapes. Lay theories of personality, such as dispositionism and the entity view, produce the social expectation of character consistency in authentic self-presentation. How such lay theories and social expectations may have evolved and why we may wish to open them up to critique will be further explored in Chapter 6. But for now, we'll move on to this section, effort and authenticity. I've already highlighted the association commonly made between character consistency and authenticity. We tend to think that the more consistent a person is over time and in different situations, the more authentic they are. There is another similar association to be drawn between effortless self-presentation and authenticity. We tend to think whoever is presenting themselves apparently more effortlessly is also presenting themselves more authentically, because if you're being your true self, you wouldn't need to work at that, would you? Conversely, during my PhD research project, whenever I remarked that I felt exhausted at the end of my performances, I would be asked whether this exhaustion was a contradiction to my claims of feeling authentic when performing character. This implied the intuitive assumption that effortful self-presentation is inversely correlated to inauthenticity. That the more effort you're putting in presenting yourself in front of others, the less authentic you're being. But self-presentation is a form of communication, like what I'm doing right now. I'm communicating to you and I'm presenting myself as a form of communication. And communication is a fundamentally effortful endeavor. How we come across when we communicate is determined by social feedback. Am I being understood when I speak like this? Am I being stigmatized in this voice? Am I perceived as interesting when I speak like this? Authoritative? And this kind of internal questioning may very well occur consciously or unconsciously, or alternately both. But this social feedback is what gives rise to the personal accent. Voice, one of the characteristics so intimately associated with the person, so often read as the personal essence broadcast from within, is in fact an instrument that is subtly tuned from without. Communication is always in some way effortful. Some amount of energy must be expended It is just that we get really good at it over time. When we learn a new language, we are reminded of the effort required of communication, a striving. Perhaps it is impossible for me to be authentic when I learn a new language, not possessing, as yet, a self that speaks in that way. And often teenagers learning a second language in school for the first time feel awkward and embarrassed about pronouncing foreign words in front of their peers, perhaps because they feel they sound inauthentic in the guise of another tongue. Even learning our first language as infants was a striving, a constant process of social feedback and conditioning of vocal sounds. Me, just being me, speaking as I speak, involves a constant listening out for how I am perceived and adjusting accordingly. Striving to come across a certain way in response to the social milieu seems to be indispensable to social persons, for no lesser a reason than that recognition and belonging as a means of collaboration is necessary for human survival. What does this mean for acting? Or where does the line between inauthentic artistic performance and authentic self-presentation lie? There are fields of study that delve precisely into this grey area. For example, Arlie Hochschild found that the emotional labour carried out by service workers, such as flight attendants, involves a committed practice of deep acting in order to perform the service role and keep customers or patients at ease. And furthermore, that the characteristics performed during work hours seems to leak into other facets of life and become more permanently integrated behaviours in areas outside of work. The phenomenon of emotional labour seems to mirror, in some ways, the pathways I traversed with my changing accent as a teenager. The striving to belong, communicate, avoid social penalties, and perhaps also gain social upper hands, likely provides enough motivation for an individual to initiate a form of deep acting, that is, an acting which, quote, involves putting effort into actually feeling and expressing the required emotions, end quote. Or more broadly in this case, behaviours, not just emotions. And that quote comes from this footnote 280, Yongbiao, Liu et al., and this article, Surface Acting or Deep Acting. So, in other words, like what I'm describing here with the deep acting as a form of acquiring a sense of social belonging is comparable to that phrase, fake it till you make it. The notion of deep acting is at present largely applied to discourses on mental health and labour and is usually referred to as a negative drain on workers. This is evocative of the documented draining effect of code switching on individuals belonging to marginalised communities. These are occasions where the individual themselves experiences their performance as inauthentic, leading to known adverse psychological effects, such as cognitive dissonance, a condition eloquently described by W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk. However, frame switching shows that this is not always the case. A shift in character, even if it entails effort, can be perceived by the individual as authentic self-presentation. I am inching towards a subtle distinction that has been one of the trickier aspects of this research to communicate. There exists the burden of having to perform, as cited in studies on emotional labour and code switching. But there also exists the burden of being rejected by society for overperforming, that is, presenting too many conflicting characters, as cited in studies on frame switching and the multicultural experience. A good example of this distinction occurred when an interlocutor of my research explained that they found the implications of my performance work regrettable because it seemed to suggest that the individual is never free from performance and must always shoulder the oppression of performing before others. Such continual non-stop performance, according to my interlocutor, is a characteristic of the oppressive outcomes of living in a capitalist society. There is certainly truth to this statement. In addition to work on emotional labor and code switching, scholars of social interpolation, such as Simone de Beauvoir, Louis Althusser, and Judith Butler, have eloquently put forward how our personal performances are instituted and guided by the puppet strings of power. Further, Mark Fisher has asserted that personal identities have had to become more flexible in late capitalism to match the growing precarity of their employment status. But there is also another perspective to take, and indeed all four of these scholars have provided nuanced counterbalances to the above positions. For me, my performance practice has been a site of liberation, because as someone who frame switches daily between multiple characters with which I authentically identify, I have, on the contrary, experienced the social conditioning towards a consistent, singular self-presentation oppressive. The right to be variable without social repercussion is what I yearn for. And indeed, the pressure to attenuate myself into a single character, consistent regardless of the social context or era of my life, is, I argue, even more evocative of the forces of capitalist culture. The demand to sculpt a singular self on social media, on CVs and on bios, is the demand to maintain a consistent personal brand, the brand of the self. Besides, as Mark Fisher also astutely pointed out, raw authenticity is highly marketable. Performance practice as self-priming. So here I'm going to talk about how all this kind of psychological research that we traversed through, in which we saw how cultural psychology researchers were able to induce frame switching in their participants in their experiments, I'm going to show how I kind of was doing something similar to myself in my performance practice and exploring the mechanism of frame switching in my own performance practice. Earlier I explained that in studies on frame switching, multicultural participants are induced to frame switch through the use of cultural primes, stimuli that, being laden with cultural associations, activate a specific knowledge structure or cultural frame within the individual. I would like to suggest that the self-estrangement process I described as the initial stage of my performances is equivalent to a kind of self-priming process, in which I use certain simple stimuli to induce myself to frame switch. Such primes include, among others, altering my physical appearance and looking at my reflection as I perform, placing myself in an unusual setting, or changing my accent. Accent has been shown to be a particularly powerful primer in frame switching studies, even more powerful than a person's visual appearance. In my experiences of performing, deliberately changing my accent and then hearing myself speak in this way is often enough to put me in a different frame of mind. However, the knowledge structures activated in my performances go beyond the remit of frames I identify as belonging to my own self-concept, because in performing, I deliberately explore new frames or new characters to adopt in a state of deep acting. In a sense, when I'm frame switching in everyday life, I am still switching between characters which I confess to being me in social settings. But in my performance practice, I have a bit more freedom to kind of switch into characters that I wouldn't normally be allowed to own as part of my self-presentation in society. So a greater breadth of potential characters were suddenly available to me in performance. Today, people are significantly exposed to diverse cultures through media, not only through heritage or where they live. We see characters on the radio, on TV, or music videos online. So does that mean that one can inherit another culture through sufficient exposure, remotely, not only firsthand? If exposure, rather than genetic inheritance or residential status, is what really contributes to the construction of people's cultural frames, then maybe my performance practice is an active attempt to cultivate the production of such frames, or knowledge structures, or characters within myself. Call it frame acting, not method acting. I say cultivate because I'm not constructing my cultural frames out of thin air. My performance method involves searching for some manner of being already existing in me. This could be a simple pattern of behavior that I picked up from a character in a film or an acquaintance at a party. I then try to fan this initial spark of behavior until it becomes a complete character, at which point I endeavor to become comfortable in their skin. Character as a state, not a trait. In exploring frame switching, we are provided with a contextual view of the person. Hong and their research team have proposed a dynamic constructivist approach to researching culture and cognition, placing an emphasis on the active negotiation of culture that takes place within individuals in given contexts, arguing that the effect of culture upon cognition should be viewed as a state rather than a trait. The notion of a cultural frame as a state rather than a trait could be applied to character, a character state rather than a character trait. Frame switching studies provide some empirical basis for the hypothesis that character roleplay can activate a different knowledge frame and enable or limit one's thoughts in a novel way. In a performance experiment I conducted, the details of which can be found in the 4th experimental report associated with this thesis, Thought Shift Performance Experiment, link below, I found that when I adopted a new character in a given performance, I was led to have thoughts, ideas, and entertain opinions that have never occurred to me before. When character is switched, mind frame is switched. The notion of a frame and how it affects behavior has been explored in other domains, not only culture. For example, researchers have shown that when presented with a moral dilemma, participants reacted differently when they judged the dilemma hypothetically than when they were immersed in a VR simulation of the dilemma and had to react in an embodied way, suggesting that hypothetical judging might be a fundamentally different frame of mind to embodied decision-making. Another domain in which frame can be found to govern behavior is in AI models. DALL-E 2, the image-generating AI model by OpenAI, is the kind of artist it is and produces the kind of images it produces based on the data of labeled images it was trained on. The training data can be seen as a frame that affects the behavioral outcome, the character of the AI artist. Character is then not only, as we have previously defined, a pattern of human behavior that is transmissible between human beings when they enter the social milieu. Character is a frame. When one character is adopted, a position, a perspective, an approach to the world is assumed in favor of that which could have been assumed through the adoption of an alternative character. So we've now come to the point of seeing character, yes, not only as a pattern, but also as a frame. And that actually switching character, switching frame, frame switching, implies also switching worldview. So that can be quite provocative in a way. If we can switch character frame within performance practice, we can change worldview by activating different knowledge structures that we have absorbed and inherited. And playing around with that could mean playing around with substantially different worldviews simply through performance and simply through the development of a performance practice that is informed by everyday frame switching. So we've looked at the notion of a character as a frame so far. Now we're going to take the idea of a character further through a different analogy, and we're going to look at character as a climate next.